We're seeing food prices rising. They have been rising, in fact, since about 2020. So it's not just the war in Ukraine, but clearly the war in Ukraine is having an impact. We saw global food prices hit an all-time high in March in terms of the global food price index. So I think it's certainly having an impact, but there are actually many different shocks and stresses that are affecting the global food system currently.
Well, give us a context of what's impacting and how it compares to historic shortages.
Sure. So I think the things you need to be aware of is that there's multiple shocks and stresses that are currently compounding, all coming together and having this effect on global food prices. So yes, we have the war in Ukraine currently, and of course Russia and Ukraine together account for around 28% of global wheat exports. Also really important in terms of exports of things like sunflower seeds and sunflower oil, also other types of grains and wheats, things like barley and corn, etc. So that's certainly having an impact. Russia is also the world's major exporter of fertilizers. And of course, Russia's been really important for supplies of global oil, and oil underpins the entire food system, everything from fuel on farm, also just to production of fertilizers and through, of course, to transportation of food. Then we have the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has significantly impacted food systems right the way through our food supply chains, and everything from shortages of labour, just having enough labour to actually pick crops on farm and then to pack and transport those crops as well. But then thirdly, of course, we've also got the impacts of climate change around the world. So we have, of course, what we've seen here ourselves. We've had floods, we've had bushfires, and prior to that, we've had drought as well. And we're seeing these kinds of impacts of climate change around the world. So I think we need to be aware that it's not just the war that's happening in Ukraine, it's also a whole range of other factors and pressures affecting global food systems.
Yeah, so it's almost like this perfect storm. Which countries are feeling the impact the most?
Well, the countries that are feeling the impact the most are those that are most dependent on imports. And unfortunately, they are some of the poorest countries in the world as well. So they're countries in parts of Africa, countries in parts of Asia as well, who are really feeling the impacts. These are places sometimes where people might be spending half of their spending on food and are left with very little really to spend on other things as well. Of course, here we are a big food exporter, and so we're buffered a little bit from those increases in global food prices. I think people will certainly be feeling it at the supermarket checkout, but we're not feeling it as much as in those other countries that are very dependent on food imports.
Yeah. You know, you talk about us being a sort of a big exporter, so we're cushioned to a degree, but do you think the Australian government has been taking, you know, the system seriously enough, and should we be doing more to prioritise food supplies?
That's a really good question. I think we should be doing a lot more to prioritise our food supplies. We think of ourselves as being a big food exporter, which we are, but that does not make us food secure. You know, we need to be doing more to plan to make our food systems much more resilient to these shocks and stresses in the future, because unfortunately, this is a long-term trend. These shocks and stresses are not going to stop when we look at the impacts of climate change. For instance, we're seeing these shocks and stresses much more frequently on our own food system here. So it's something that we really need government to be planning actively for how to strengthen the resilience of our food systems in the long term.
And we perhaps have greater capacity to adapt. When you're looking at some of the nations that you're talking about, they're highly stressed in many cases. The systems have been run down and the processes have been run down. So what can they do to get back on track?
Well, I think for some of those poorer countries in the world, some of the countries that are really dependent on food imports, it's partly about ensuring that you're producing as much of those staple foods internally, domestically, as possible as a buffer against those spikes in global food prices. It's really about supporting smaller scale farmers who produce much of the world's food and who are sometimes themselves not able to afford sufficient food as well. And then, of course, just in terms of sufficient income and sufficient social protection for people when they are affected by these rising food prices.
Yeah. You know, how do vulnerable countries shift from necessarily a emergency mindset to one that is planning and supported?
I think that's a really good question. We do tend to focus on the short-term emergency food handouts, but of course, what we really need to be focusing on is the long-term planning. And I think, again, that gets back to what I was saying about really supporting smaller scale farmers in those countries who are producing much of the world's food. They're really struggling with the impacts of climate change and ensuring that people have sufficient social protection mechanisms in place so that they are cushioned against these impacts. But it's really the long-term planning, really, that government needs to undertake. All countries should be planning for this, including our own.
You know, when you think of, say, how voracious nations like China have become and developed nations, we expect so much to be available to us sort of 24/7, you know, 12 months of the year. Does that mindset have to shift a little?
I think it does, in the sense that we need to be more prepared for those sorts of shocks to our food system. I guess the first time in Australia during COVID-19 was the first time many people may have seen that supermarket shelves were empty. They couldn't always find what they wanted to at the time they wanted to buy that food. And I think that we are going to see a bit more of that in future. Clearly, there was sufficient food on supply shelves. We're not going hungry here in Australia. Those of us who can afford to buy the food that's on the shelves, that's really the critical issue. There is currently food on the shelves in Australia that many people cannot afford to buy. And it's really about government planning to ensure that everybody can afford sufficient healthy food, and that it's a basic and fundamental human right.
Let's come back to Ukraine and Russia. Russia itself is withholding exports. They're not allowing them to move out of the ports. You know, if that continues, is it like a declaration of war on food, as has been said?
Look, I don't know if I would call it a declaration of war on food, but I think, you know, we can say that it is having a significant impact on the global food system. And unfortunately, it's likely to continue to do that for some time. This doesn't look like a situation that's going to resolve anytime soon.
Good to talk, Rachel. Thanks so much.
Thank you.